If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, everyone. This is John Patrick, trying to do up the buttons that get increasingly difficult to do up as my peripheral fine sensitivity is drifting away, like many other things at my age, but not everything, fortunately. I want to talk to you today about a book I was reading this weekend. This weekend in Canada has been the May weekend, which is extended into Monday as a sort of time to get your garden in, which of course I haven't done. But it was also a chance to go and visit my second daughter's cottage, in inverted commas, on a lake just an hour's drive from our farm. And about just over a third of the whole family were there, i.e. something over 20 of us. I didn't count, ranging from through grandparents, parents, and 2 levels of offspring. So 4 generations were present. The youngest ones being a couple of 2-year-olds who were a pleasure to watch, as long as one didn't have responsibility for their infinite capacity to create chaos. But lovely to watch us, and to watch the way in which the parents gently tried to guide them towards better ways of doing things. But I also took a book with me, which was Oliver O'Donovan's Resurrection and Moral Order. And I've been trying to read this completely for years, and I think this time I will eventually get around to it. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about that and see where we get to. But I want to read from his preface. He says, some years ago, I was attempting to teach a course in the area of evangelical ethics, designated as General Christian Ethics, Fundamental Christian Ethics, Christian Metaethics, or Foundations of Christian Ethics. My own preference for the name Christian Moral Concepts. But when there came upon me, partly through the blank faces of my students and partly through self-generated doubts, deep frustration with the current options for approaching it. This is what made me immediately sympathetic to this book when I started, because when ethics started to be taught, I was deeply unsympathetic with what is happening. I appreciated what the intent was, but it seemed to me quite obvious that it wasn't going to do what needed to be done. And as I said to our dean at the time, if you think an ethics course will create ethical doctors, I think you're wrong. You may create some doctors who are amateur ethicists, and they're likely to be more of a pain than a help. But you will not and cannot create ethical doctors by that means of education, which is too reductive. The conversation that grew out of that ended up with me having a dean-approved after-hours course on medical humanities, basically introducing students to well-written material which raised ethical questions without getting into boring, reductive pseudo-philosophy. O'Donovan goes on, I was, I suppose, discovering without knowing it the force of what has come to be called in some circles anti-foundationalism. I had grown up on an approach which treated this area simply as a form of apologetics. There seemed to be, we used to say, this and that and other difficulties with the idea of Christian ethics, but the difficulties turn out on examination to be less conclusive than they first appeared. Christian ethics may therefore proceed on its way unimpeached. With such an apologetic strategy undertaken and sustained in its own terms, I have no quarrel, and towards some of its most skillful practitioners I feel nothing but gratitude. My unease rose from the substitution of this exercise for a study of Christian moral concepts. I found my students in Toronto justifiably disconcerted to see their professor parrying unheard-of attacks upon supposed well-understood positions which no one had expounded to them. And as I reflected, I came to realize that Christian moral conceptions were never expounded in the tradition that I knew, for the apologetic strategy had, on the whole, found it convenient to work on the assumptions of a divine command theory, which had been the object of skeptical attack. There was a further point that dawned on me, when, though I should have understood it earlier, my teacher Paul Ramsey once wrote, "Christian theological ethics is meta-ethics, and the Christian community in all ages is a standing meta-ethical community of discourse." It required only a little reflection to turn this proposition around and conclude that the exploration of Christian moral concepts must always, in the first place, be the work of theology. This book grows out of my belated recognition of the fact. It is an assertion of moral theology which ought to be present in the Christian ethic. So that's what the book is about. And certainly I needed it, and I imagine therefore that many of you who are in the medical community in one form or another would benefit from thinking about it too. Animals are not ethical. Animals run on instincts. We have the gift of rationality, which forces us to look at things and to see this might not be the only answer to the question that bothers me at the moment. And then the issue of truth arises, which our world has been trying to neglect for a while, a few centuries, by pretending that science can answer all the questions. During the course of this book, O'Donovan points out very clearly why the reductive approach to science, which is now dominated, combined with historicism, which we'll hopefully come to in due course, are not satisfactory for us. And in fact, they are deeply wrong from a Christian point of view. So why does he entitle his book Resurrection and the Moral Order? Well, what happened at the resurrection? That's the issue. Creation, Christ points out, and it's pointed out throughout the Bible, is ordered and coherent. And it's ordered and coherent in two distinctive ways, which you can find laid out for you in the first chapter of Colossians, if that is your inclination at the moment. It's worth thinking out very carefully and slowly. The only pure teleological relationship is between creator and creature. There's no truly teleological relationship in nature. It doesn't work that way. Christianity has always seen human generic relationships as free from natural teleological order. Hence, Christians have always known, although not practiced, that racism and sexism are wrong. Not because of any abstruse argument. It's something that ought to be seen immediately as a human being. Our problem ethically is the one that Acton describes and I use all the while. Freedom is not the freedom to do what you wish. That's a 2-year-old concept of freedom. But true freedom is to do what you ought. And we're not very good at that. So the problem lies not in mere information, but in the will. We're not good at that. And it's easy to get people You need a few steps in this for a devout secularist, but my bubble over the head approach works perfectly well. None of us could live with a bubble over our head declaring our thoughts to everybody around us. In other words, there's a huge mismatch between who we are deep down and what we know we ought to be. The animals don't have that problem. Only we have that problem. And when we pretend that we are just animals, we are doing serious damage to the thing that makes us different from the animals, and also more capable of thought. But they're a bundle of instincts. They don't think things out. When it comes time to die, they lie down and die. They are totally accepting of the world as it comes. We like to think they aren't, that they're always thinking about the member of the family who got carried off by a hawk or whatever. That's not the way they function. Just instincts. But we're not like that. We have instincts, of course. But we're much deeper than that. Let me read the opening. I say let me, isn't that a strange phrase? You have no option except to turn off. Here's the opening paragraph of O'Donovan's book. What I read before was from the preface, and it's worth reading the preface if you get the book. The foundations of Christian ethics must be evangelical foundations, or to put it more simply, Christian ethics must arise from the gospel of Jesus Christ, otherwise it could not be Christian ethics. It is, of course, quite possible, for it has often happened and does happen, that Christian believers have ethical convictions that do not arise from their faith in Jesus. There can be ethical Christians without there being Christian ethics. It is possible, too, that such believers may actually produce theological arguments for separating faith from their ethical convictions. Certain forms of belief in natural law, or in the opposition of law and gospel, make a virtue of denying that Christian ethics in the strict sense can exist. Such theories may allow the Christian faith has a bearing on ethics indirectly, that Christian spirituality promotes a heightened concern for moral dimension of life and a strengthened ability to cope with it. But the substance of ethical questions they hold is not open to special illumination from the gospel. The believer is in no more favoured position than the unbeliever when it comes to discerning the difference between good and evil. We must observe what follows from separating faith and morality in this fashion. We become either moralists or antinomians. By moralism, we mean holding of moral convictions unevangelically, so that they no longer part of Christian good news and can therefore have the effect of only qualifying it. Whereas, as a preparation for the evangelical approach, as a ministry of condemnation, as St. Paul says of the Mosaic law, or as a rule which is supposed to govern an area of life which Christ has not touched or transformed. By antinomianism, we mean holding the Christian faith in a way that expresses disregard or insufficient regard to moral questions, dismissing them. Once it is decided that morality is no part of the good news that Christians welcome and proclaim, believers will have to choose between being thoroughly evangelical and ignoring it, respecting it at the cost of being only half evangelical, being the alternative. A belief in Christian ethics is a belief that certain ethical and moral judgments belong to the gospel itself. A belief, in other words, that the Church can be committed to ethics without moderating the tone of its voice as a bearer of bad tidings. Already in St. Paul's letters to Galatia and Rome, the twin temptations of antinomianism and moralism are identified as dangers. What Paul observed, however, is that they are simply two sides of one and the same temptation, which he called the flesh. This highly suggestive association of law and license, anticipating certain modern psychological observations, sprang from the perception that all alternatives to evangelical ethics, which Paul presents as life in the Holy Spirit, have become something fundamental have something fundamental in common. Every way of life not lived by the Spirit of God is lived by the flesh. By man taking responsibility for himself, whether in libertarian or legalistic ways, without the good news of God, has taken responsibility for him. Consequently, we cannot admit the suggestion that Christian ethics could pick its way between two poles of law and license in the search of middle ground. Such an approach would end up only being what it is from the start, an oscillation between two sub-Christian forms of life. A consistent Christianity must take a different path altogether, a path of an integrally evangelical ethics which rejoices the heart and gives light to the eyes, because it springs from God's gift to mankind in Christ Jesus. Now, you've never heard a medical ethics lecture, I suspect, that began with saying the resurrection is a fundamental idea behind a rational and hopeful set of ethics. But that, in effect, is where O'Donovan is going to take you. I think it surprises a lot of people. It certainly surprised me when I read the title, Resurrection and the Moral Order. Did it change? Well, no, but what did change? As Jesus points out in the Sermon on the Mount, from the point where the Jews were given the law, the Torah, to the point where Jesus rose from the dead, the law had been changed en route. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount actually is doing a long discussion of the difference between the use of the law as viewed by, shall we say, an observant Jew, where to this day the Jews say that if we kept the law, the Messiah would come, because there would be a perfect world for him to come to. But there's no evidence of that happening at all, is there? Look around the world. And Jesus says, no, that's not the point of the law. Even if you kept the law as perfectly as the Pharisees, who took it down to minor details of life, that's a good thing to do, to think about what is the good way, the best way to do things. But it will not bring you to heaven, which is a place of perfection. The law is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, as Paul put it. We need to understand the law and to maintain it in our families and in our schools and in our communities as a base to give us a picture of how big our problem is. Our problem is not with knowledge. We all know when we've done wrong, and we know when we've done good. Sure, there are blurred areas because we refuse to think about them carefully. But we all have moral knowledge, unlike the animals who don't have it. They have instincts. They have no moral responsibility. We know. Even watching the 2-year-olds this weekend, they knew when they were doing wrong, and they went ahead to do it anyway. And interestingly, on one of those occasions, the result was a timeout on the stairs to think about obedience. And amazingly, it really surprised me, because she's quite a strong-willed little person. She sat on the stairs and waited till the timeout was over. She didn't argue against it. Somewhere deep down in that little soul, there are the beginnings of the growth of a genuine Christian morality growing up in a Christian home, which is a blessing beyond belief for children. When you think around the world, if you could give one thing to children, it would be Christian parents that would change the world within a generation. But because we don't think about these things, particularly in Africa, for instance, where the idea that you would be able to agree with somebody from another clan, let alone another tribe, and certainly from another country, is still almost beyond belief. The idea of objective moral truth is not being taught. It's a question how you should do that, but that we're not doing it is blatantly obvious. You only have to listen to someone like Frank Zanu. I don't know what his belief system is. I only know that he grew up in West Africa. He eventually went to America and became an American, unlike the Muslim immigrants around the world who want to change our culture. He got his culture changed. He left a pagan animistic culture and came into a Judeo-Christian one and appreciated the difference. So now he's back in Africa, talking to Africans about their own countries and why they don't work. One of his key insights, I think, is that they don't have a really entrenched idea of maintenance, because their ideas of causation, their explanation for things going wrong in the world is evil spirits, and that makes sense. Our explanation is that the problems lie within us. We all know what we ought to do. Our problem is not knowing. Our problem is willing, doing. The problem is in the will. And as Paul says, who on earth can fix that? Well, that's what Romans 8 says. If we have a role to play through the Spirit, then change can occur. Not the Spirit alone. You don't get anywhere simply by holding your hands in the air and assuming the Holy Spirit will be working in your soul. It has to be combined with you sitting down and thinking out what the mind of Christ would look like. Paul at the end of Romans doesn't say you need renewed feelings, which is what most of us go to church for most of the time. You go for a renewed mind, which is usually going to make you feel terrible until you are obedient. So that's one way of approaching, in a shallow way, what O'Donovan is going to take a book to take you through. What is the nature of a Christian understanding of ethics? Now, the ancient world, in many ways, was better off than we are. They accepted some categories, particularly the Greeks. Although, amazingly, I discovered in reading O'Donovan this time that my simplistic understanding of how Aristotle interacted with Christianity was wrong, because it didn't interact really at all for the first 10 centuries or so. The bit of Greek philosophy that fitted more easily for Christians was Stoics, not Aristotelian. So, and that made sense with me because I grew up in a Judeo-Christian world of working-class England, and their real philosophy was Stoicism. You didn't get cuddled and told how to be a victim. You say, well, suck it up, lad. That's what it's like. Get on with it. The world is to be accepted as it is. So, and that led to a flourishing community because it had a Judeo-Christian base. Working-class Brits don't read. They haven't been reading forever, most of them. I mean, they stopped going to church, the working class, in the early part of the 20th century. And there's some evidence that they're going to come back now. And I hope that grows. So the only book they knew, not that they'd read it, but it had been read to them every day for whatever it was, their 12 years at school. In many cases it was less than that. It was 10 years. But for that period of time, every day at school, something from the Bible was read to them. And it was read in a context where it was presumed to have authority. It wasn't said, it was presumed. So the only book that working class kids actually knew, although they had only been read to, they hadn't read, was the Bible. And so it gave them their default for behavior without them thinking about it. That's what culture is. And we shouldn't talk about racism, sexism, and those things. You've got to talk about culture. And culture, basically, a Judeo-Christian culture, requires you to find out what you're good for and what you're good at, and then to accept it. That's Stoicism in a way, but it's also Judeo-Christian thought. Here we have no abiding city, but we seek a city whose builder and maker is God. So here, yes, we do have to think in categories that don't get mentioned in church. It's been appalling for me to watch over my academic lifetime as students have their world systematically reduced. So most people, even with a university degree, cannot read a great novel with understanding because they haven't been taught the structure. They've been reduced into functional people in particular places, but that doesn't make them wise. You only have to ask any student of yours that's your family that's in the university, has the word wisdom occurred in any of your lectures this year? And have you ever felt wiser at the end of a day? No. Wisdom? Gone. Gone. I mean, the problem was articulated centuries ago in the 12th century. Some seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. We still do that. Others seek knowledge in order that they themselves may be known. That's a professor. They don't care about anything other than their reputation. They're narcissists, and increasingly we are a society of narcissists at every level. Beauty has been reduced to admiration by others, which is a very limited description. So, yes, just curiosity is fine. That's what I did for years. That helps to learn. Then wanting to be known, well, that's vanity. It's part of who we are. We like to be admired. We like to be noticed for good things. Then he says, then there are others who only seek knowledge in order to sell it. And you only have to look at the way multimillionaires and billionaires or whatever are admired and set up as models, and yet most of them can't manage a marriage for any length of time, and their children are a disaster. It's a very limited way of looking at things. And Bernard of Clairvaux, who I'm quoting, says of that is a dishonorable way to live. If you only want to sell knowledge, you're not going to be a real person at all. You're going to have a miserable life. And then he says, and there are others who seek knowledge in order to edify others. And that is love. And it is. And trying to do that, however inadequately, does bring you that sense of love, joy, peace that we're supposed to have. When someone says to you, oh, years ago I heard you, I was in your class and you said X or Y, just as O'Donovan remembers when Paul Ramsey got to his mind and put it into a new gear. I mean, he's very modest in what he says, but very few people read Paul Ramsey these days. I wish they did, especially doctors. Patient as person should be read. But O'Donovan is recognized by almost everyone who's got a good mind of, well, I don't share his views, but I don't think I want to debate him. That tells you everything, doesn't it? So, what difference does it make? Well, if you put the world into categories that classically emerged, basically 4 categories to think about, and then we'll come to the Christian ones, how Christianity used these. But the ancient world understood that people actually desire to be good, in the sense they desire good things for themselves, and then they have to work out to what extent good things for myself should be shared, etc. What is community? And as Alan Bloom says, a community is something that invites everybody into a common story of meaning. And meaning doesn't occur in school these days. Jordan Peterson started talking about it, and look what it's done. I mean, he can fill, 6,000-7,000 seat auditorium just to listen to him for a couple of hours. He was doing psychology and helping to the minor extent that psychology can. But once he started talking about meaning and purpose, he moved into a new era. And of course, he's inevitably having to deal with the nature of God. We'll be, hopefully, before I run out of time or steam, that we'll at least get that far today. But so the first thing that the ancient world understood was that you could divide things into material things and immaterial things, matter and things that were not matter. I mean, it comes as a shock to modern students when you point out that immaterial things are actually more important to you than material things. When the person you thought was the love of your life leaves you and dumps you, no material change has occurred, but my goodness, has a real change occurred? Of course it has. The immaterial world is far more important than the material one. After all, you even read one of the other books currently I'm reading is an account of history in the Middle Ages, where the author Barbara Tuchman points out from the research she's done, a nobleman, in inverted commas, in his list of in his will had 2 sheets as one of the things he gave away to the servants. He had next to nothing except his honor, which mattered to him more than anything else. And it existed in terms of chivalry and warfare. Yeah. Driven by immaterial things again, and when it becomes material, in due course you have a problem. So the material and the immaterial were recognized early on. The material, the matter, and the form, the ideas that allow you to look at matter and do things with it. If you want an easy model to remember to get these 4 ideas clear in your head, just think of a statue. I got this idea from who was it? Come back in a moment. Begins with L. Isn't that odd? But Michelangelo looked at a block of marble, the material, and he could see what was in that block. And he thought of his art as liberating what was in the stone. Now, he needed his incredible physical capacities to chip away at that stone in a way that no one else could, and end up with his amazing sculptures. That's the efficient cause, the tools that he designed and made and the skills that he honed. But at the end of the day, why did he do it? He did it to beautify the city, to make people stop and think. There are modern architects who sell their rubbish for thousands of dollars because people will pay for it and call it art. We had some rusted metal put outside our central police station in Ottawa, and it was sold as architecture for thousands of dollars. And the artist said, well, it will rust away. That is a good reminder for the police that everything they do has no permanent significance. How terrible. How terrible. Whereas Michelangelo stops you in your tracks and starts you meditating on all sorts of things. Great art does that. Great in all sorts of art. The proper words in proper places stop me in my tracks, Shakespeare's incredible capacity with language. Sadly now, most students can't get over the first fence to be able to relate to Shakespeare. I mean, if you were teaching it, you've got to get them over that fence, and it's quite possible to do that. Good teachers can do it. To be or not to be, once they've learned it, that's all about meaning, isn't it? Yeah. So, those 4 categories, the last one being, what's the purpose of the art? What's the purpose of the literature? What's it for? Teleology. Now, what happened to us in the Western world was that we lost our way. And I do it in a very simplistic sense, and I have now to incorporate O'Donovan into it slowly, and I won't do it very well to begin with, because the area that I was concerned with was science, and science is essentially an act of reductionism. You pretend that all those four causes, except those material ones that you can measure, you can dispense with them for the purposes of science. You measure things and you draw conclusions, and that gives you some new questions that you can measure and draw conclusions. And it was profoundly successful with its start in the late 13th century and its incredible development up until about the time of Darwin, when it started to become more and more reductive. And now science is being turned into technology, applied or not, and lacks a lot of what the great scientists of the past did. Absolutely new conceptions are forced upon us by things like the Webb telescope and the discovery of DNA, and the techniques can force us back into thinking about ourselves. I don't see how anyone could do the major sciences and not have enough sensitivity left to be somewhat awestruck at some point. If you're doing science and you're not awestruck every now and again, you're really only doing applied technology. Science, really, real knowledge, you're immediately aware of your own smallness and your own limitations. And that's a great step forward, because you start working at that. Now, it's quite clear that deep discontent with the basic structure of life is growing. You only have to look at your colleagues if you're in an academic world like me. Many of them were very full of themselves as I met them along the way. But the few whose names have survived and are likely to survive that I had the privilege of meeting, by and large, not entirely, but by and large, they had some sense of privilege that they had been allowed to do what they did. The conversations, say, between Penrose and Jordan Peterson illustrate that very well. So those four became two, and then basically one. And we have to go backwards again to get them. And what O'Donovan is starting with, why did he start with resurrection? Well, he says that nature, which has a law to itself, is capable of being understood in a law-like fashion. Nevertheless, we manage to destroy it because of and that's what the fall is about. God gave us a framework within which to live, and we chose to not live that way. He didn't desert us, but we had to learn moral consequence. Because obviously the whole project is about becoming people who can have fellowship with God. And moral consequence has to be recognized in that story. And so ethics that don't start with a discussion of those questions is not really ethics at all. The modern life, in proclaiming the resurrection of Christ, the apostles proclaimed also the resurrection of mankind in Christ. And in proclaiming the resurrection of mankind, they proclaimed the renewal of all creation around him. The resurrection of Christ is the isolation. In isolation from mankind would not be a gospel message. The resurrection of mankind apart from creation would be a gospel of sort, but a purely Gnostic and world-denying sort, of which is far from the gospel the apostles actually preached. So the resurrection of Christ directs our attention back to creation, which it vindicates. But we must understand creation not merely as the raw material out of which the world we know is composed, but as the order and coherence in which it is composed. Not to look at it, but to look in it. He points out that, let's see if I can get this right. I may get this wrong, in which case I'll have to come back to it next week when I've got it clearer than I think I have at the moment. But we live in two worlds which need to be integrated. We live in a world of realities outside ourselves, which we did not produce. Ideas of justice, truth, love, mercy. These do not spring to us through a science approach. We also live within an inner world, which has presumptions from a bigger world. In other words, this is what people like to talk worldview. That's perfectly reasonable. I have no problem with that. We live within a story, but we have beyond us a much bigger story that actually integrates both. We have reduced our story. The reductionism of science leads us to want to explain things in a way which can only be a partial explanation at best. For me, as I've said in several recent talks, I was stopped in my tracks this Christmas by realizing how far I am from the Lord I say I follow when I read Isaiah's account of the incarnation. And he said of the Messiah, he will delight in the fear of the Lord. Delight?